Iran has voted and there's a hint of change in its national parliament, but the real power lying elsewhere. Can anything really change? And does a conservative future in Iran keep in line with the principles of the revolution 30 years ago? Or does it actually go against it? This is Inside Story. Hello there, I'm Kamahl Santamaria. It was an election where the result was never really in question, but the implications were and perhaps still are. Hardliners allied to Iran's president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, seem assured of victory in the country's elections. But more moderate elements won enough seats to suggest he may now face a tougher time in parliament. Analysts had predicted voters, tired of high inflation, fuel shortages, unemployment, they might opt to elect Iran's more moderate conservatives. But that doesn't appear to have been the case. Reformists were pushed into a poor third place and are still claiming success, though, given hundreds of their candidates were banned from taking part at all. Around 60% of Iran's 44 million voters turned out on Friday, according to the country's Interior Ministry. A race for more than 50 of the 290 seats will go to a runoff vote next month. But while Iranian politicians compete for more power in the new parliament, average Iranians continue to struggle and to make ends meet. This is what some of them had to say.
A great deal of people are literally under economic pressure. The government, cabinet members and members of parliament have to really do something about high inflation. Otherwise, the entire society is at risk.
Those who are elected and become members of the parliament should seriously meet ordinary people's demands and take care of people's well-being. The economic situation is so terrible that we see housing prices and inflation rise 10 times overnight.
Honestly, there are many problems in this country that everybody is aware of. We have a lot of expectations, so they have to work very hard.
We expect them to deal with people's problems, whether they are social, political, cultural or communal.
Let's bring in our guests now on this edition of Inside Story. In Tehran, Saeed Mohammed Marandi, he is a political analyst and professor at Tehran University. Over in London, Nazanin Ansari, a diplomatic editor at Kayhan newspaper. And in Washington, D.C., Trita Parsi, he is the president of the National Iranian-American Council. Thanks for joining us, everyone. I want to start in Tehran with Saeed Mohammed Marandi just to get an idea of the reaction in Iran to these elections, and particularly this whole notion of the moderates perhaps being able to make life a little more difficult for President Ahmadinejad.
Well, it's unclear exactly how the new parliament will turn out. In the elections, there were four main factions, especially in Tehran. All four of these main factions fielded candidates for all the seats. The pro-Khatami reformists, the pro-Karoubi reformists, who Karoubi was the former Speaker of Parliament, and then the pro-Larijani and Ghalibaf principalists or conservatives, whichever one you'd like to call them, and the principalists or the conservatives that were closer to the president. In Tehran, the president did better than anyone else by far, but it remains to be seen how he performed and his supporters performed throughout the country. So I think it'll take a few days to really figure out what's going on exactly.
Okay, then Nazanin Ansari in London, at this point, what do you make of it? Again, this whole notion of more moderate players in Parliament causing problems in the future for President Ahmadinejad. A lot of people are suggesting that. Do you think it's possible in the future?
Well, I don't think so. As a matter of fact, only 2 weeks ago, one of my sources was telling me that the principalists were going to win 70% of the Majlis votes. And in fact, the 8th Majlis will be even more conservative than the 7th. As far as the reformists are concerned, unfortunately, the reformists have themselves been divided into various factions, two of which, as your guest in Tehran has mentioned, Mr. Karoubi's reformists and those that are close to Mr. Khatami took part in the elections. But as a matter of fact, Mr. Marashi, who heads the headquarters of the reformist coalition with the principalists, he himself has said that under their calculations, more reformists had to get into the parliament, whereas the Fars news agency, which is the news agency very close to the Iranian Revolutionary Guards and the intelligence ministry, has reported that all the candidates in Tehran, and this is only about the elections in Tehran, are from the principalists. So one has to really take with a grain of salt all the calculations that are coming from Tehran and from elsewhere. And on top of that, according to the Ministry of Interior's website, the number of eligible voters in Tehran is much more than actually the people who have taken part. In effect, what they said, that if 60% of the eligible voters in Tehran have voted, but with the amount of votes in Tehran, one can only say that only 27% have voted. And this goes across the provinces.
Okay, then. I want to also bring in the idea, because this idea of being eligible or not, I think is very important. You've talked about the voters. We've also got the issue of the reformists who were deemed ineligible by the Guardian Council. Now, a lot of people have talked about that and said it shows it's not free, it's not fair. They've got a point, don't they?
Well, they do. This time, not only did the candidates have to be approved by the Guardian Council, but in the first level of disqualifications, actually it was the Ministry of Interior that had to vet them in the first place before they reached the Guardian Council level. And also on top of that, when the votes are counted, it's once again the votes have to be approved by the Guardian Council. So as you will note, there's so many different levels of counting and of qualification, disqualification, that there is a real big mess. But does it matter at the end? No, it doesn't matter at the end, because at the end of the day.
Surely it does matter at some point. Actually, let's stay with this idea. I want to pause for a moment because I want to talk a little about the electoral process. It's a complex one. The EU, as I mentioned, condemning it as neither free nor fair. And the result depends largely not on the choices of the voters, but on the country's most influential body, as we've been talking about, the unelected Guardian Council. It is led by this man, Ayatollah Ahmadinejad. It's made up of a dozen clerics and lawyers who have the power to ban candidates from standing. This time around, some 1,700 candidates were barred. Most of them were, as we've mentioned, the reformists. The council says it's its duty to protect the country's future against those who aren't committed to its Islamic values. Reformers, though, say the veto power is undemocratic and goes against the very principles of Iran's revolution. Trita Parsi in Washington, D.C. When you look at it like that, it looks like a very, very undemocratic process. Does it not really make the elections look like a bit of a sham, really?
Certainly, there are unbelievably undemocratic elements in these elections, and it's extremely important to keep that in mind, because the political spectrum that has been permitted by the Guardian Council and then Department of Interior, Ministry of Interior, has shrunk significantly and at the same time shifted to the right. But to, at the same time, then argue that this means that the elections are completely irrelevant or inconsequential, I think would be to go a bit too far, in the sense that we saw that from the previous elections, when people boycotted those elections, it only enabled those people on the far right to be able to gain control in a way that people perhaps did not expect. And a result of that is to see the significant shift to the right and the shrinking of the political spectrum that certainly is not democratic.
Iran has, of course, had a reformist parliament 10 years ago, presumably at the people's will. But again, it goes back to this idea that it basically got shut down by the judiciary. Now, again, it doesn't really seem to make sense. What is the point of having elections if, in the end, the judiciary has the final say over the whole thing?
Well, it is a very complicated process, but what you're seeing is that people are trying to change the system from within. They're trying to create reforms. They're trying to advance various ideas in spite of these obstacles. Now, if one completely dismisses this process, well, then the only way out, the only way to be able to get any type of a change would be some sort of revolution or a violent revolution, which the vast majority of the Iranian people do not seem to have the appetite for. Not because they're in support of the current system, but simply because they don't have much faith that revolution and that type of an uncontrolled change can actually bring about a better situation.
Nazanin Ansari in London's shaking her head. Why is that?
because Mr. Parsi is adding 1 + 1 and getting a result of 4. Whereas, there is no, what is happening at the moment is that you see that even now when there is no, there hasn't been any concerted effort for boycott, people have not been going to vote at all because they do realize that at the end of the day, their votes don't count. But there are other solutions that have been put forward by various parties, is that to have free and open and fair elections. That is not something very difficult to ask for, and that is not asking for a bloody revolution. What you need to do, and this is according to various politicians and various parliamentarians who have been disqualified in Iran, is that to be able to run in free and fair and open elections where all kinds of candidates can take part. In effect, there was one candidate, Mr. Muezzin, last week. He gave an interview to the Voice of America Persian News Network. And what happened next? He has been charged with treason. This is not the way to run a country that has a population that is very much educated, politically motivated, politically aware. But unfortunately, the system at every single juncture is trying to put a damper on this motivation and keep the voices down.
Okay, then we're going to take a break. We've obviously got lots more to talk about. When we return, we're also going to look at the Islamic Revolution and the role that's playing in current Iranian politics. We're back in a moment.